We're now in the chapel court of St John's College in Cambridge, where I arrived in 1951. That's a photograph taken on the day of the degree ceremony, where you receive your degree from the Vice-Chancellor of the university. I moved from Cambridge to St Antony's College, Oxford, to do research in Russian history, and that is a photograph of the students and fellows of St Antony's then, which was, I think, in 1955. I studied Russian history here for about 18 months, and then I got a scholarship to study in America at Stanford University, which had a wonderful collection of Russian newspapers, magazines, and so on from the period I was studying. So I came back as a research fellow, which meant that they paid me instead of me paying them. I spent 2 years as a research fellow here until I was offered the opportunity to work for Sir Anthony Eden, our former foreign minister, who was writing his memoirs, and he wanted help. We're standing in St James's Park in London. At that end of the park, you can just see the Foreign Office, the British Foreign Office, with the building with the square tower. That's where I started work in 1960, having decided that I didn't want to be an academic after all, and I preferred to be a diplomat. It was a very old-fashioned environment then. My time as private secretary to James Callaghan, whom I accompanied on his visit to Budapest in 1975. These are quite different visits. That photograph was taken when we visited Rome and in 1977, and we called on the Pope. Another visit with James Callaghan was to a conference with the German Chancellor Schmidt and President Giscard of France and President Jimmy Carter of the United States, and that's a very informal photograph taken of Jim Callaghan and his wife and Jimmy Carter and Rosalind Carter there, other members of James Callaghan's staff, and that's me. We're looking the red brick building there is number 12 Downing Street, which is next door obviously to number 11, and next door to number 11 is number 10, which is the Prime Minister's official residence, and I worked there for 2.5 years from 1977 to 79. You can just see part of number 10. That's the bit of white building with the green roof there, which is part of number 10. Behind that balcony was the dining room of number 10, where I remember on the first night after she was elected, in fact on the same day that she was elected, in the evening, Margaret Thatcher gave supper to all the private secretaries and other staff in number 10, her political staff, and she cooked the supper herself in her home in Chelsea, and it was taken by taxi to number 10 and unloaded and taken up to the dining room, and we had a very nice family supper there with Margaret Thatcher and her family and all of us. It was a tradition that when a private secretary to the Prime Minister was coming to the end of his or her time, they had a certain privilege of being able to more or less choose their next job, what they wanted to do next, within reason, of course. So when my time was almost up at number 10, Margaret Thatcher sent for me and asked me what I'd like to do next. And I'd already paid one visit to Hungary, to Budapest, with James Callaghan when he was Foreign Secretary. That was in 1975. 4 years earlier. And so I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to go back to Budapest, which I found very attractive. That we do not represent the government of the country, we represent the Queen. And so it is the Queen, in my case Elizabeth II, who appoints you, and that is her signature there, and the signature of the then Foreign Minister. This document appoints me to represent the Queen in the character of our Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary at Budapest. So that was my letter of appointment. That's the official photograph taken of me just before I went to Budapest. Moving on to my appointment to be British Ambassador in Moscow, that's the photograph which was the official photograph which was taken just before I went. And that again is the Queen's letter, document appointing me to be ambassador in Moscow with her signature. It's her actual signature. The photograph which was taken in the Kremlin of me sitting there, my full uniform, and members of my staff and also members of the Soviet Foreign Ministry. That is one of my dispatches from Moscow. About perestroika.
Вот почему правительство Великобритании придает большое значение совместному протоколу о сотрудничестве в области информации, культуры и образования, подписанному во время визита госпожи Тэтчер.
Then from Moscow I moved to be principal of Linacre College in Oxford, and that is a picture of me at my desk in Linacre College, and I spent 8 very happy years doing that job. One of the rules of Greek tragedy was that hubris, in other words, an excess of pride, would inevitably be followed by nemesis, which was cruel fate. I suppose the first example of Hungary's hubris being followed by nemesis was when the Hungarian state was at its peak in the Middle Ages under Matthias Corvinus and commanded enormous influence and also territory in Europe. I mean, one tends to forget that under Louis the Great, Hungary, the Hungarian kingdom, extended almost up to the Baltic and almost down to the Adriatic. In fact, it did extend down to the Adriatic. It was a major European power at that time. The reign of Matthias Corvinus complemented that territorial and military power, political power, with cultural distinction by attracting scholars, artists, sculptors to what became a flourishing cultural centre in the Hungarian capital. Inevitably, according to the Greek rule, hubris would be followed and was followed by nemesis, which took the form in Hungary's case of the disastrous defeat by the Turks at the Battle of Mohacs in 1528. The ultimate moment of hubris in Hungarian history, namely the celebration of the millennium in 1896, when the entire country was, but especially Budapest, were en fête in celebration of 1,000 years of Hungarian history. That was an amazing occasion. I'd love to have seen it. That, of course, sadly was followed just 2 decades later by the First World War and the disastrous defeat, and finally by the Treaty of Trianon. And the Treaty of Trianon, I suppose, was the ultimate nemesis for Hungary. When the Archduke Ferdinand and his wife Sophie, when they were murdered in Sarajevo on the 28th of June 1914, István Tisza, who was the Prime Minister of Hungary, was on holiday at his estate in the east of Hungary, Guest. And he rushed back to, first of all to Budapest and then to Vienna, because he was a member of the Ministerial Council of the dual monarchy. He arrived in Vienna and found to his dismay that the Austrian, the foreign minister, Count Berchtold, persuaded the emperor to agree to launch a surprise attack on Serbia in retaliation for the assassination of the heir to the imperial throne, Ferdinand. István Tisza himself was not at all in favor of a surprise attack on Serbia, because he correctly foresaw that the result of an ill-considered action to attack Serbia would be a world war, or at least a big European war. On the 23rd, when the telegram had gone off from Vienna to Belgrade containing the declaration of war by the monarchy, there was a tornado in Budapest, an extraordinarily powerful storm with thunder and lightning and a very powerful wind, which took the roof off the basilica, for example, and destroyed a number of buildings. I think one or two people were killed even. And if Tisza had been, well, he was a religious man, but he might have interpreted what happened as a sign of divine displeasure at the decision he'd agreed to. The dual monarchy in the years before the Great War was not actually as strong as it looked. It had many very serious problems. For Hungary, the most difficult problem was that of the nationalities, who were, and had been for some years, had been wanting to achieve their own national destinies, their own national identities. The Hungarian government, frankly, had not dealt with that situation very well. Right at the end of the war, the government was on the point of collapse, and the monarchy itself was already beginning to disintegrate, because the various ethnic independence movements had established their own assemblies in their own parts of the monarchy, and had declared their independence and their allegiance to their mother countries, their ethnic mother countries. The Romanians in Transylvania to Romania, the Serbs in the south to Belgrade, the Slovaks in the north to what was going to become Czechoslovakia. The political situation in Budapest was critical. The existing government collapsed, and the natural person, so far as the populists were concerned, to take over was Mihai Károly, who was a very complex and interesting man. Károly came from one of the great families, great aristocratic families of Hungary, and had a very privileged upbringing and background. However, he was born with a very severe physical handicap in that he had a cleft palate, and so he could not, in his early years, he found it very difficult to speak at all. He was an inveterate gambler. He had a lot of money to gamble, and he gambled it all, and quite addictively. In October 1918, when Tisza was at home in his villa, and the army by this time had fallen apart because the war on the Eastern Front had ceased as a result of the Bolshevik revolution. And so hundreds of thousands of troops, Hungarian troops, had come back from the Eastern Front and were just milling around in Hungary, mainly in Budapest. The war on the Italian front had ended finally in defeat, and the level of desertions was enormous. And so there were a lot of mobs of unhappy soldiers milling around looking for trouble. And one group of them burst into Tisza's home, his villa, in Pest, and confronted his wife and his niece, I think, who were in the house at the time. Tisza's butler, his servant, had knew what was going to, or sensed what was going to happen, and had advised Tisza to escape from the house through a back window, jump down and run away. Tisza refused to do that. He said, "I've spent my life standing up, and if necessary, I shall die standing up." And that is what he did, because the soldiers burst in, accused Tisza of being responsible for the war, which of course was a travesty of the truth, and shot him in front of his wife. And he died there in the hallway of his home. The troops who had not deserted, there was, in effect, a revolution on the streets of Budapest. Károly willy-nilly found himself at the head of what was called the National Council, which established itself in the Astoria Hotel. Charles IV abdicated, and Károly became de facto Prime Minister of Hungary at the head of a provisional coalition government. In that capacity, he tried to persuade the victorious allies, namely the prime ministers of England, France, Japan, Italy, to lift the economic blockade on Hungary, which was causing enormous, a very severe hardship to all the people. And secondly, to control the armies of Hungary's neighbors, who were taking advantage of the chaos to grab as much as they could of Hungarian territory. Sadly, the Supreme Command in Paris, the Supreme Council in Paris, took no notice whatsoever of what Károly was trying to achieve, they regarded him with some suspicion, especially the French did, because they knew about his left-wing views and they thought that he was the next worst thing to Bolsheviks. And so they were not disposed to take what he was asking them to do very seriously. The result was that Károlyi found it increasingly impossible to retain control of the country. His cabinet, which consisted partly of liberals and partly of socialists, found it difficult to agree on his program for land reform. The liberals or liberal conservatives thought it was too radical. The socialists didn't think it was radical enough. Károlyi resigned the prime ministership, became president of the new republic, as it now was, as Charles IV had abdicated. And the prime minister he appointed was Dénes Berenkei. Károlyi himself, as president, inaugurated the implementation of the land reform in rather a moving ceremony on his own estates, where he stood in the middle of a field and amidst a crowd of thousands of peasants and said, "All this is now yours." What he didn't say was that actually it didn't belong to Károlyi either, because of partly of all his gambling debts, all his estates were heavily mortgaged to the banks. So Károlyi was in fact giving away what didn't belong to him, but this wasn't revealed at the time, and the grand gesture was very effective. Now, the Allies in the Supreme Council in Paris still paid no attention to Hungary's plight. They sent various emissaries to assess the situation, and they were persuaded by what they saw that Károlyi had to be helped. If he was not helped, they feared, the Bolsheviks really would take over, or the communists really would take over. But the French in particular remained deaf to these reports, and the inevitable happened. The socialists, who saw which way the wind was blowing, concluded, without Károlyi's knowledge, an alliance with the Hungarian Communist Party, which had only been formed a few months before, and whose leader was actually Béla Kun had been imprisoned with some of his supporters for allegedly murdering some policemen who were guarding the offices of a newspaper, which the communists had tried to break into. But he was able, even in prison, to remain politically active and to organize the Communist Party and to conclude an agreement with the socialists, so that the socialists and the communists now became one party, effectively. The one thing everybody agrees about Béla Kun was that he was very ugly physically. He was a smallish man with a big head and certainly not at all good looking. But he had tremendous energy and he was a very good speaker. He was a very good orator. He had been taken prisoner during the war by the Russians when he was fighting on the Eastern Front. And he was already very far on the left wing in his personal politics. As a prisoner of the Russians, he became a full-blown Marxist and communist, idolized Lenin as his hero. When the war ended and the prisoners were released, he came back to Hungary and began to organize the Hungarian Communist Party. And as I've said, he led the party into alliance with the socialists and indeed took over the combined political party. Kun's ambition was to build a communist state on the Leninist pattern. Indeed, he wanted to do it even better than Lenin had. He thought in a small country he stood a better chance. He did not become prime minister or, as they call it, president of the council of ministers. He became foreign minister, but he actually ran the government anyway, and established what was called the Hungarian Republic of Councils, which were the equivalent of the Soviets in Russia. All industry and agriculture was nationalized. In order to solve the housing problem, every person was entitled to one room, and one room only. And so in larger houses of the middle classes, workers moved in to occupy the spare rooms, as it were, and food was rationed very strictly. And indeed, the only people entitled to ration cards were members of trades unions. And so if you were not a trades unionist, in theory, you couldn't eat. You were dependent on the charity of a relative who happened to be a trades unionist. And of course that led to a black market and all the regrettable consequences of that. As in Russia, the so-called revolution was accompanied by terror. Decrees were enforced and counter-revolutionary activity repressed by means of open terror, by execution squads touring the country and hanging, or in some cases mass shooting, of anyone thought to be against the regime. Bela Kun nationalized, of course, the media and took complete control of the radio and the newspapers, transformed many churches in the countryside into cinemas where propaganda films could be shown to convert the peasantry to communism. Kun, because his reforms were meeting already quite considerable resistance, especially in the countryside, employed, just like Lenin, the instrument of terror in order to achieve his objective of building a communist state. He set up, or he allowed, one of his close circle, Tibor Samueli, to tour the country in a special armored train. The so-called Red Terror inflicted several hundred, nearly 1,000, according to some estimates, deaths on mainly in the countryside, where the resistance to communism was great. This reign of terror, although it was relatively short in time, left an indelible impression on the Hungarian national psyche and disposed them permanently and very virulently against communism and, by extension, against the Soviet Union from which communism had come. It had another effect as well. It happened, just as in Russia, that Bela Kun himself and most of his associates were Jewish. And the association of Jewishness with terror and communism revived a level of a kind of substratum of anti-Semitism, which had always existed in Hungary right from the Middle Ages and certainly through the 19th century, just as it had in Poland and other Central and East European countries. It is thought to have accounted for about between 600 and 1,000 lives. Nobody knows exactly the extent of the death toll, but it was very considerable. Many hundreds of people died during the Red Terror. Significant success which Bela Kun achieved was to organize national military resistance against principally the Romanians and the Czechs, who, as I've said, were grabbing as much Hungarian territory as they could occupy. The Czechs from the north, the Romanians from the east. The Romanians had actually advanced not only into the area which the Supreme Council in Paris had authorized them to occupy as part of the armistice which had been concluded by Caroy with the French, but had gone beyond that and actually crossed the River Tisa into Hungary proper, and the road to Budapest lay open. The Czechs had advanced right down through Pozsony and Kosher to the borders of the Felvidek, and again threatened Miskolc, for example. Bela Kun organized essentially a new army called inevitably the Red Army, and consisting not only of troops loyal to the communist regime, but also of officers from the Imperial and Royal Army who were prepared to serve under communist command in order to defend their country against the Romanians and the Czechs. And the chief of staff of this new army was who had been commander of the military academy in Budapest and turned out to be a very effective chief of staff. And he conducted a campaign, first of all, against the Romanians and then against the Czechs, which was extremely successful. And the Romanians were driven out of Hungary, virtually, and the Czechs also were driven northwards back into Slovakia. However, the Supreme Council in Paris, who of course were violently anti-communist and foresaw that Bela Kun was the forerunner of a Bolshevik invasion of Europe from Russia, the true Red Army, and they refused to give Bela Kun not only any assistance, but they ordered him to withdraw from those areas which his Red Army had occupied. Bela Kun, in the end, had to accede to these requirements, because if he had not done, the Romanians in particular would have been given free license to carry on resume their invasion of Hungary. He was promised that if he withdrew his forces from the area occupied by the Czechs in the north, they, the Allies, the Supreme Council in Paris, would bring about a withdrawal of Romanian troops from the east of Hungary. And so he complied. He withdrew, and the effect of the withdrawal was to cause a complete collapse of morale in the army, because they'd just been winning great victories and suddenly they were told to retreat. This was a terrible blow to their morale, and they never recovered from it. The Red Army was no longer an effective force for the defense of Hungary. In the ensuing chaos, during which Bela Kun tried to launch a new offensive against the Romanians but failed, Bela Kun decided that the game was up, and his regime faced complete collapse. And after just 133 days in power, he fled, first of all to Vienna and subsequently to Moscow, where he, in the 1930s, became a victim of Stalin's purges. It was shown subsequently by Bela Kun that the Hungarians were very willing, very eager indeed, to come together in defense of Hungary against the Czechs and the Romanians and the Serbs. And if Károly had been a different kind of leader, he could have done the same as Bela Kun did. He could have said to the Supreme Council, I'm not going to accept this. I'm going to fight. I'm not going to accept it because our country cannot sustain such a disastrous humiliation. We're going to fight. I'm sure the country would have rallied behind him. So that was the dramatic but ultimately failing story of the Hungarian Republic of Councils. That episode of communist rule, short though it was, had a very profound effect, I believe, on Hungary's future, because it gave all Hungarians a profound antipathy to communism, and by extension, a profound hostility towards the Soviet Union as the main headquarters and source of communism. This, I believe, was one of the main factors in Hungary's subsequent political orientation during the 1930s. While all this turmoil was going on in Hungary, the Supreme Council had begun work on the preparation of peace treaties with all the defeated allies on peace treaties with Germany, and also with all her allies, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, Turkey. Obviously, the main work of the conference was the peace treaty with Germany. There also had to be treaties with Germany's allies, but they were regarded as being of less importance, and consequently, much of the preparatory work for those peace treaties was left to officials. It's very important to realize that Hungary did not lose 2/3 of its territory simply because of the Treaty of Trianon. She had already lost practically all that territory when the conference began. It was already a fait accompli because the dual monarchy had imploded and its fringe areas had already broken away. And so the task of the peace conference was not to take territory away from Hungary, but simply to delineate with precision the new frontiers of what were called the successor states. In other words, the new, hopefully democratic states which were going to replace the dual monarchy. Czechoslovakia, the new Greater Romania, and Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia consisting of Serbia and Croatia and the other Balkan countries, the other Slav Balkan countries. The disaster had already occurred before the peace conference even began its work. However, when it did begin its work, the two committees of officials which were established to delineate the frontiers in Hungary's north and also in the east and the south were consisted certainly on the British side of two officials who were already, I'm afraid, very ill-disposed towards Hungary. And they were Harold Nicholson, who, for reasons which I never have quite understood, felt a kind of, not a hatred, but a dislike of Hungarians and Hungary, and Alan Lipa, who wasn't so much anti-Hungarian as pro-Romanian. And so the committees on which they each sat, Harold Nicholson on the one dealing with the north and Leaper on the one dealing with the east and the south, already had that inbuilt anti-Hungarian presence. The American members of the committees were very determined to implement the 14 points of their president, Woodrow Wilson. And one of them, of course, was self-determination on the basis of ethnicity. And so the Americans were concerned that the new frontiers of these new countries should reflect the ethnic composition of the area concerned. And the Italians were only concerned really with grabbing as much of the Balkan coastline, Dalmatia, as they could for themselves before Yugoslavia took it over. And so each of the four powers had different agendas, really. And because the French plus the British plus the Italians usually voted against the Americans, the decisions in each individual case usually went in the direction which Hungary would most disadvantageous to Hungary, which was very unfortunate and helped to produce such an inequitable outcome. Now, the two committees worked not jointly but separately, and in other words, those working on the new frontiers of Czechoslovakia were not at all concerned with or even aware of what was going on in the other committee, which was concerned with the frontiers of Romania and the new Yugoslavia. And so they both went along separate tracks with no coordination between them. And it was only right at the very end of their work that it was realized that if you added together the amount of territory which one committee had taken from Hungary and added it to the amount of territory which the other committee had taken away from Hungary, the result was enormous. But by then it was too late to do anything about it, because the two committees, as well as not liaising with each other, had been working in the belief, and quite well-founded belief, they thought, that their work was simply preliminary, and they would produce drafts, kind of maximalist drafts of what, in each case, the peace conference should aim for. They thought that once their work was over and their drafts were complete, these drafts would be laid before a large conference or congress in which the whole thing would be negotiated not only between the Allies but also with the former enemies who would have a chance to argue their case. But somehow, in the course of the proceedings of the conference, which went on for over 2 years, the original idea of having a final conference or congress was abandoned because everyone was tired and wanted to go home. And they thought it would be far easier to dispense with that and simply accept what the various committees had come up with and turn those recommendations into a final treaty. Finally, when after the Bellokun regime collapsed and a semi-democratic government had taken its place, the Supreme Council, who had sent a British diplomat, Sir George Clerk, to look at the situation in Hungary and see if they were ready to be and fit to be invited to take part in the final proceedings of the conference. They were invited. He recommended that they were just about ready to, they were just about respectable enough to appear in Paris at the negotiating table. The Hungarians, I think, in retrospect, unwisely, chose Apony, Albert Apony, very much an archetype of the old Hungary, very conservative, white beard, high nobility, a very worthy man and a very able man indeed. But he didn't present the kind of image of Hungary which might have won more sympathy. Moreover, when he was invited to make his introductory speech before the leaders of the Supreme Council, he, although his presentation was superb, he not only delivered it almost without notes, but in absolutely fluent French, which he then translated himself into English. And then concluded by summarizing everything he'd said in Italian. It was a quite virtuoso performance, but his whole approach and that of the Hungarian delegation was, I'm afraid, in retrospect, one can see misguided, because there was no hope by that time of completely changing the whole structure of the peace treaty. All they could hope for, and the British Prime Minister Lloyd George tried to advise Apony in this sense. All they could hope for was to get changes of detail in the frontier delineation. What Apony seemed to be demanding was that the whole of Old Hungary should be restored and that there then should be plebiscites in the disputed areas, so that the local population in those areas could choose whether they wanted to be part of Czechoslovakia or part of Hungary, part of Romania or part of Hungary, part of Yugoslavia or part of Hungary. That was simply impossible of achievement. It was totally unrealistic. There was no way the Allies were ever going to agree to that. What they might have agreed to were small modifications of frontiers in specific cases where it was obvious that many Hungarians had been handed over to other states. If they'd adopted that piece-by-piece approach, the sum total would have been quite significant in the end, if they'd done it right the way around the circumference of Hungary. But that was not the approach which Apony adopted or had been authorized to adopt. And so, magnificent though his speech was, it fell, I'm afraid, on completely deaf ears, and the Hungarians were were given the final terms of the treaty, which were exactly what the two committees had come up with, exactly what they recommended, not amended in one dot or comma, and had the effect of taking away from Hungary 2/3 of her territory, half her population, virtually all her forests, virtually all her mines, in other words, a massive percentage of her natural resources. And they were told to go away and think about that and come back in, I forget, a few weeks' time with their comments. And of course, they came back with reams and reams of paper detailing why this was totally unjust and inequitable, which it was. But when they came back, they were very brusquely told that, sorry, either take it or leave it. The dream of regaining the territories which Hungary had lost, not entirely as a result of the Treaty of Trianon, but the loss which was confirmed by the Treaty of Trianon, was common to all Hungarians after 1919, 1920. It was certainly one of the main factors which moulded the political landscape of Hungary between the two wars. It would have been impossible for any Hungarian politician to be elected if he did not support the cause of revision. Revisionism had really begun as soon as the Treaty of Trianon was signed on the 4th of June 1920. Its slogan, which was taken from one of the editorials of the newspapers at the time, was Nem, nem, soha, no, no, never. And that slogan was reproduced in thousands of contexts, on postcards, on posters, in the newspapers, in souvenirs, on boxes of chocolates. It was a slogan which really dominated the 1920s and 1930s. It was, of course, totally unrealistic in the sense that there was never any possibility that Hungary could regain all the lost territories, as for of Trianon begins with a very compressed chapter on called Hungary's 1,000 Years, which is a very short summary of Hungary's history. And the first paragraph of that chapter reads as follows: "The history of more fortunate nations is punctuated by triumphs and victories. The history of Hungary is punctuated by disasters and defeats. The Hungarian achievement is survival and recovery."